So this morning we are going to talk about the gift of frankincense. But as Dustin and David both alluded to, we wanted to start off each session with a bit of a disclaimer, and you've heard this already, but I want to repeat it. And part of the reason I'm going to repeat it is you guys aren't the only ones that listen to what happens here in the morning. We post our messages online, and I don't know, I think on any given month, maybe we've seen as much as 100 downloads to, I think over time it's now up to 7,000 or 8,000 downloads. And so other people listen at other times, and so they don't always listen to the series in order. And so if somebody were to grab this one just because they're interested in it and didn't know what we're going to do, it'd be good to give a disclaimer. So as we had kind of mentioned at the very beginning, our approach to the Scripture is to take it at face value, which means what it says is what it says, and what it means is what it means. And we don't like to read into the text our own ideas or our own thoughts. However, throughout church history, when it comes to the gifts that the Magi gave, there's always been speculation as to was there some particular reason why they chose gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And if it were just some radicals out there making speculation, that would be one thing. But this has been by our church fathers, people like Irenaeus and others, who, as far back as the first century, suggested that there may have been some symbolic meaning in the gifts that the Magi brought. The problem with that is it's hard for us to turn to the Scriptures and specifically say, it says right here that the myrrh represented this and the frankincense represented this. So we have to rely on other things. And so we're always cautious whenever it comes to that. Usually Dustin and I, if we have an opinion about something, we'll tell you, this is my opinion here. We're going to speculate a little bit. We're very, very careful about doing that. And so we wanted to make sure that as we approach this series on the symbolic possibilities between gold, frankincense, and myrrh, that we simply make that really clear. We're not saying that the Magi chose these gifts specifically for these reasons. What we're saying is they might have. There's probably dual reasons why they did, and we'll see that as we look at the past or look at some of the stuff today. But I think it's appropriate at times to listen to Christians throughout history that have held opinions about things and to weigh what it is that they've suggested and not just write it off. And we've joked about this, how when Dustin first brought this up, I kind of wrote it off because I'm like, I don't know, that's too much speculation. Even Dave, when I brought it up to Dave, he's like, yeah, my red antennas go up immediately, I don't know about this. But I think we've been cautious. Dave did a great job last week talking about the value of gold and why they might have given gold to Jesus. It served, it was a gift that they often gave to kings, so that would make sense. They came to honor a king and they brought him gold. That makes perfect sense. But there's also intrinsic value in gold, and it would have been a valuable thing for Mary and Joseph, especially since they had to leave their home and go to Bethlehem, and then instead of being able to return back home to Jerusalem, where'd they have to go? They had to flee to Egypt and spend 2 years in Egypt fleeing Herod so they wouldn't have to die, and that gold might have come in handy just for them to provide for their means. Plus, David even mentioned last week that we don't know what happened to Joseph. After Jesus' 12th year, he falls out of the story. The implication would be that he was no longer around. He'd probably died. And so how would Mary have been able to help care for her own children? A 12-year-old in Jesus. He had younger brothers and sisters. So how might she have done that? Well, it may have been that the gold provided a means to do that. We don't know for sure. So we're going to go ahead and look at the second of these gifts today, frankincense. And again, as we approach this, we're just going to look at the sort of the practical things. What is frankincense? How might it have been used during that first century? But then whether or not there's symbolic meaning in that applies to Christ. And so we're going to follow sort of that same pattern. We'll do the same thing next week with myrrh. But again, understanding that we're kind of on that edge, meaning we're not saying this is why they chose it. We're saying they may have, partly because of it. And again, I think there can be some value in that as long as the things that we tie the symbolism to are true scripturally. The problem you run into with symbolism is when you come up with a theology based off of symbolism that's just like, that's nowhere else in the scriptures. What we're going to see today is that the symbolism I'm going to suggest is something we find in the scriptures that's true about Christ. So that's, I guess I'll say, our protection there. And I think that's partly why people like Irenaeus and others in church history have been willing to speculate or talk about the symbolic nature of some of these gifts, because they saw some of that symbolism reflected in Christ. So we're going to go ahead and do that today. So let's first talk about frankincense itself. Frankincense ultimately is a resin, and what that means is they would find a particular tree. I can give you all the names of the trees and stuff, but I don't think that necessarily matters. But there were trees that grew primarily in part of the Middle East and southern Arabia. And when they would slice the trees open, there were 3 times a year where these trees would provide sap. And so they would put slits in the trees, and it would cause this sap to come out. And it's kind of a whitish, milky sap. And as that sap would come out of those trees, they would collect it. But as it basically comes in contact with oxygen, it would turn into this resin, which is kind of like best way to describe it is if you saw the resin, frankincense, even myrrh is very similar, it makes like these little rocky crystals. And they're somewhat smoky colored, or sometimes a little borderline like translucent, maybe a yellowish or a brown. And so if you had a bowl of this resin that had now solidified and had been broken into chunks, it would basically be like little crystals or little rocks of sort of more like a yellows and browns and other things. And what they would do with that is they would take that resin then, after it had been collected and hardened, and they would do 2 things with it. One is they would pound it into a powder, and that would become incense. The other thing they would do is they would run it through a distillation process, which is where frankincense oil comes from. So they would run it through this distillation process, and the oil would come off, and they would collect that oil. So frankincense was primarily found in those 3 forms. The resin form, the raw resin form, that's usually the way that they would collect it and sometimes even sell it that way. But then it would be primarily used in those other 2 forms. A powder as an incense, or oil. And so that's really what you have when you get to the 1st century, is you found frankincense in those 2 primary forms in the market and other places. What's interesting about this is most people, when they describe, like, let me ask you this, how would you describe, you can maybe get a scent of it in here, but when you think of frankincense, how would you kind of describe it? Because what I was coming across, I would always describe it as maybe like a woody scent, but not everybody describes it exactly the same way. Does anybody have any thoughts? Like, how would any of you describe it? Anyone want to take, you don't want to be wrong. You can't be wrong. Kind of a smoky scent? Amy?
A hint of sweet.
Kind of a hint of sweet, yeah. Anybody else? Probably one of I think the commonality that I found as I looked at this is most people said it smelled earthy, kind of woody, with a hint of pine, but also a hint of citrus, like lemon. My wife's really good at those scents. She can pick stuff up. Me, I'm just like, oh, it smells awful. And she'll say, well, it smells like this. Same thing with colors. She'll talk about colors where she can say, oh, that's got yellows and browns or blues. And I'm like, huh? She's pretty good at that kind of stuff. So, but most people would describe it as being kind of earthy, a woody scent, kind of a hint of pine or maybe some citrus or some lemon. In Jesus' day, frankincense was such a prized commodity that there was actually a 1,200-mile trade route that was used to primarily traffic frankincense and myrrh from southern Arabia up to the Mediterranean coast. 1,200 miles, and it was established primarily for traveling frankincense and myrrh. In fact, there were 2 names given to this. One of them was the Frankincense Road, I believe, if I can find it in my notes. 2 names. The Incense Route was one name, but the second and most prominent name was the Frankincense Route. And so because it was such a prized possession, they needed to basically travel it from southern Arabia, which is the primary place where it was found, traffic it up to the Mediterranean, and so they put a trade route together primarily for that. Now they used that trade route obviously then for other things. Once, they would had established the route and everything else. But an interesting thought on this too, it was so important to Roman society that the Romans, as a government, imported 3,000 tons every year. I don't know what the Roman government used it for, but 3,000 tons of frankincense they would bring in. it was also extremely expensive. If we were to take the raw resin from that day, before it had been pounded into a powder or distilled, just the raw resin, the hard crystals, and we were to translate the cost in today's dollars, that would sell for about $500 a pound. Now, there was only one other type of substance like this, resin, that was more expensive than that, and that's myrrh, which is almost $1,500 a pound. Most of what I could find on it suggested that frankincense and myrrh oftentimes are considered more valuable than gold. So this was a prized commodity, extremely important to the culture and society, which then gets us to how it was actually used in the ancient Near East. I've got, 3 categories I'm going to highlight here, 4 categories. The first one is it was used as a medicine. You can go back all the way to the 1500 BCs in Egypt, and their most important medical document, it's like an encyclopedia of medicine as far back as the 1500s of BC in Egypt, and they listed frankincense as a treatment for asthma, bleeding, throat infections, vomiting, and other ailments. In the first century, the Greek physician, I won't give you his name, but probably one of the most prominent Greek physicians of the first century, stated that it could, quote, fill up hollowness of ulcers, that means heals ulcers, it could glue together bloody wounds, and it was used as something called an astringent. If you know what an astringent is, it's something that helps stop bleeding and swelling and oozing sores and stuff like that. And so the Greeks used it as well to help with wounds. Pliny the Elder, a first century Roman author, naturalist, philosopher, and then military commander, wrote that frankincense was an effective treatment against hemlock poisoning. They would actually consume it. If you would come across hemlock and were poisoned from it, you could consume it and it would help protect you from hemlock poisoning. The Chinese used it as an internal medicine, but also for surgical procedures to help with wound care. It had anti-inflammatory properties, so it would help with swelling, and it would help with blood circulation and pain management. So it was used pretty heavily in the first century all over the world, not just Jerusalem, as a form of medicine. I think Amy would even mention that there are uses today for frankincense oil as a medicine. It was also used as a perfume. It was probably the second most popular, was that it was used as a perfume. We're going to see next week with myrrh. Myrrh was also used as a perfume, but frankincense wasn't quite as popular as myrrh, but it was used as a perfume. The Egyptians used it for thousands of years before Christ as a perfume. I want you to turn to Solomon chapter 3. You'll see that even in the book of Solomon we find that it's used as a perfume. So chapter 3 of Solomon. Oops. Chapter 3, I think it's verse 6. Yeah. What is this coming up from the wilderness, like columns of smoke, perfumed with myrrh and, look what else is there, frankincense, with all scented powders of the merchant. He's likely talking there about the importation of frankincense and myrrh as a perfume, and your caption there may refer to that section as Solomon's wedding day. That would be a typical interpretation of that. And so he's talking about myrrh and frankincense there being used as a perfume, likely for his bride, but also possibly for him. Turn to chapter 4, verse 6. Now this one's a little, I'm not going to call it risque, but that might be a good word for it. Chapter 4, verse 6. We'll start in verse 5. He says, "For 2 breasts are like 2 fawns, twins of a gazelle, which feed among the lilies until the cool of the day when the shadows flee away. I will go my way to the mountain of myrrh and the hill of frankincense." He actually was referring to his lover's breasts as frankincense and myrrh. Why? Because they were perfumes, and she would have smelled of frankincense and myrrh as they engaged in their sexual encounter. And so it was used as a perfume. You know, an interesting fact I learned today about this as well is that today frankincense is used in about 15% of our perfumes. And the reason is it's a fixative. And do you know what a fixative is? It's basically what makes scent last for a longer period of time. And so frankincense has this tendency when added to perfumes to extend the life of that scent. So that as you put it on in the morning, maybe it'll last you all day. And so some of the brands that actually use it is Chanel, Christian Dior, and others. I don't know how you pronounce this. Maybe Susan does. Amouage, A-M-O-U-A-G. I don't know if maybe being associated with... What's that? Homage, maybe. But a number of extremely expensive brands of perfume use frankincense to extend their scent. Off on a weird note just came into my head when I was first started working at Chicago Title. You guys remember the scent Red? Very famous scent. I mean, back, 25, 30 years ago maybe? But her dad invented the scent Red. And as popular as it became, because he worked for the company that he invented it for, got none of the proceeds from it. And it had become an extremely popular scent. She told me at one point what he would have been worth had he have gotten a typical royalty on it if he had done it on his own. So it's kind of, just like I said, an interesting note. But I wonder if he used frankincense in red. Never know. So it was used as a perfume. A third way that it was used is it was used in burials. And, the Egyptians would use it as part of their embalming. And it's believed that part of the reason that they did that was simply because it would mask the smell of the decaying body. It didn't appear to necessarily be used to help in the embalming process. Myrrh was used for that. We're going to see that next week. But it does appear that they used it primarily because of the qualities of scent, to help to mask the smell. So they used it in burials. I came across this article that was really interesting. Just a couple of years ago, archaeologists discovered these Roman sarcophagi, basically coffins, that were still sealed. I think, if I remember right, there were 4 of them. And when they opened these sarcophagi, they could smell the frankincense. After they figure, I think these things they figured were at least 2,000 to 3,000 years old. Isn't that interesting? Now, had that been open, the scent wouldn't have lasted long, but because it was concealed, and a lot of times those sarcophagi were almost airtight. And so, thought that was rather interesting. So it was used in burials. Now, the final way that it was used was in religious rituals, and that's not really all that shocking or surprising, but most ancient religions, especially in the ancient Near East, burned incense made of frankincense as part of their religious ceremonies. And that even included the Israelites. In fact, God mandated the use of frankincense in his worship. I want you to turn to Exodus chapter 30. Exodus chapter 30. What we find here in Exodus chapter 30 is that God gave the Israelites a recipe for making their incense. Some refer to this simply as the holy incense. Exodus chapter 30, look at verse 34. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Take for yourselves spices stacked, ancha, galbanum, spices with pure frankincense. There shall be an equal part of each." So basically, he's given them a recipe that has 5 different types of spices and elements in it. One of which has to be pure frankincense. Can't be mixed with anything else. And it says, with these 5 ingredients, all of equal parts, so each one is 20% of the formula, the recipe, with it you shall make incense, a perfume, the work of a perfumer, salted, pure, and holy. You shall beat some of it very fine, and put part of it before the testimony of the tent in meeting, where I will meet with you. It shall be most holy to you. So within the tent of meeting there was a place where they would burn incense continually. And that's what this was for. There was a special recipe of frankincense incense to be burned in the temple at this particular location. It says, look at verse 37, "The incense which you shall make, you shall not make in the same proportions for yourselves. It shall be holy to you for the Lord. Whoever shall make anything like it, or any like it, to use as perfume, shall be cut off from his people." In other words, they couldn't make any other incense that smelled like this incense. Now, they could use frankincense, but they couldn't add these other elements to it. So God mandated that they make a special incense, including pure incense or pure frankincense. It appears that would be the primary element. And it was to be used specifically in the tent of meeting or later on in the temple and burned continually before the Lord as an offering. Something of a sweet-smelling aroma to him. And they weren't allowed to make that to be used anywhere else as a perfume. So as a good Roman Catholic, if you just decided one day you wanted to start smelling like frankincense, that'd be perfectly fine, right? But not back then. They couldn't remake this to use anywhere else. They couldn't use it in their homes. They couldn't use it as perfume. It was a holy or special incense that God required for use in the temple. This special incense, again, could only be used by the priests in the temple. Now, there's two other occasions where God mandated the use of frankincense, incense, for worship. Turn to Leviticus chapter 2. One of them was the grain offering. So Leviticus chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Now when anyone presents a grain offering as an offering to the Lord, his offering shall be of fine flour, and he shall pour oil on it, and look at this, and put frankincense on it. He shall then bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests, and shall take from his handful of it fine flour and of its oil and all its frankincense, and the priest shall offer it up in smoke as a memorial portion on the altar. And I love this part: an offering of fire of a soothing aroma to the Lord. The Lord could smell it. And so when they made their grain offerings, the priests were required to take some of this holy incense that had been made and supposed to sprinkle it on the offering before it was burned, so that the Lord would have a sweet-smelling aroma before him. Now the other place it was used was with the showbread. So if you turn to Leviticus chapter 24, we'll jump down to we'll start at verse 1. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Command the sons of Israel that they bring to you clear oil from beaten olives for the light, to make a lamp to burn continually. Outside the veil of the testimony of the tent of meeting, Aaron shall keep it in order from evening to morning before the Lord continually. It shall be a perpetual statute throughout your generations. He shall keep the lamps in order on the pure gold lampstands before the Lord continually. Then you shall take fine flour and bake 12 cakes with it. 2/10 of an ephah shall be in each cake. You shall then set them in 2 rows, 6 to a row, on the pure gold table before the Lord. This is what's referred to as the showbread. It represents Israel. It represents God's relationship with Israel. It's a foreshadow of the offering of Christ being the bread of life. So it says that you'll take this showbread, you'll make these cakes out of it, and you'll split it into 2 rows. And it says, you shall put pure frankincense on each row, that it may be a memorial portion for the bread, even an offering by fire to the Lord. Every Sabbath day he shall set it in order before the Lord continually. It is an everlasting covenant for the sons of Israel. It shall be for Aaron and for his sons, and they shall eat it in a holy place, for it is most holy to him from the Lord's offering by fire, his portion forever. So again, we have these 3 instances where God mandated the use of this special frankincense incense. Once was before this continually burning table of incense that would go up. And then in the grain offering, where they would sprinkle that on top of the grain offering as the priests would offer it. And then when it would come time for the priests to eat their showbread or to burn the showbread, they would sprinkle the frankincense on the showbread and burn that before the Lord, and then they would eat portions of it as well. And so you have these 3 instances where God mandated the use of frankincense. And so what you ultimately have with this is you have the priests, and this is going to be important here in a moment, the priests using the incense, but the incense also being part of the offering. That's going to be key here in a second. Now how about practical uses then in terms of why the Magi might have brought frankincense to Mary and Joseph? We already looked at why they might have brought gold. Well, for the same reason that they brought the gold, the Magi probably brought the frankincense to Jesus because that they viewed him as King of the Jews. That's pretty clear in Luke chapter 2. And it was common when you brought gifts to kings that you would bring not just gold but also spices. and frankincense, and sometimes even myrrh. And we see that in other places. Historically, there's some documented evidence that kings would do this even in secular history, especially in the ancient Near East. We also see, and David alluded to this last week in Isaiah chapter 6, verse 60, it mentions the bringing of gold ultimately to Christ when he returns and establishes his millennial kingdom. And it refers to the nations bringing him gold and frankincense. And David alluded to the fact that myrrh is not mentioned there, quite possibly because myrrh is associated more with mourning and death. And when Jesus returns, it's not about mourning and death. So we do see in the scriptures, again, even in Isaiah 60, verse 6, that it was appropriate to bring kings as a way of honoring them, not just gold, but also frankincense. And so a practical reason why the Magi might have brought frankincense is because they did what the culture expected. You're going to meet a king, you're bringing him expensive gifts, you bring him gold, you bring him frankincense, you bring him myrrh. So that's one possibility. I think another possibility would be the same reason that we saw with the gold. Remember that frankincense was expensive. They could have sold it. They could have used it to barter and to trade as they were making their way from Bethlehem to Egypt. We don't really know. We oftentimes think, we whip out our credit card and everything else for stuff. But back then they would use cash, coins, that type of stuff. But they would also barter goods. And so something like frankincense and myrrh were used to barter. They were used to acquire other goods. And so it's possible that, again, by bringing them in such an expensive gift, they could have used that as a form of bartering to help to finance their trip to Egypt and to take care of themselves. And then lastly, because of what we've seen already, it's also possible that just because of the medical value of frankincense, Joseph and Mary may have been able to take advantage of some of that. One thing we'll learn with myrrh, and it's possible with frankincense as well, because of the scent to it, and because it can mask odors, myrrh was oftentimes used in clothing. Why? They didn't have washing machines. You go out and you work and you sweat and it stinks. Same thing with their beds. They would put it on their linens or whatever you want to call them that they would sleep on. And so they'd put it in garments. And it's possible too that Mary and Joseph could have simply used the frankincense as well to help keep their garments smelling decent, especially as they're traveling and other things. And so there's any number of practical reasons why they might have brought frankincense along with the gold and the myrrh. Again, it's partly speculative, but it all seems to fit and seems to make sense. But what about the symbolic meaning? Is there any real symbolic meaning? Can we associate that? The two most prominent suggestions that are made in terms of what these things represent, two things always come to the surface. And not everybody always agrees. You look at different church fathers or different scholars or even modern scholars. Somebody last night, I think, mentioned to Amy and I, we were at Grace for their Christmas thing. Somebody mentioned that J. Vernon McGee did a series on gold, frankincense, and myrrh from years ago. I didn't know that. Everybody's got an opinion. But there's two primary suggestions that always sort of rise to the top. One is that the myrrh represented Jesus' role as that frankincense represented or symbolized Jesus' role as high priest. And why would that be? Because the priests were required to have the frankincense made and they would use it in their offerings. So they saw that as a representation, a symbolic representation of Jesus being a high priest and therefore presenting him with frankincense. Again, used by the high priest. So that's one suggestion that rises to the top. The second most common suggestion is that it represents Jesus as the sacrificial offering, because frankincense was used in the offerings. And so some see it as this is symbolic, not so much of Jesus being the high priest, but Jesus being the sacrifice on whom the frankincense would be placed and then lifted up before the Lord. I don't think we necessarily have to make a decision as an either or. We always love to have it's either this or that, and people can argue and debate about that. But what do we know about Christ when it comes to those two symbolic meanings? Christ is both high priest and the sacrifice. And if there was some symbolic meaning to myrrh, I keep saying myrrh, but to frankincense, might it not represent both the high priest, but also the sacrifice that he became? I think there is. And so, again, is that why they chose it? Last night, one of the things that Dwayne was doing some storytelling during the presentation last night at Grace, and he made a comment about, I don't know if the Magi knew that this was the Son of God. I believe they did. I believe because of the two different instances where it's mentioned that they worshipped him, that it was more than just bowing down and paying homage. I believe that they recognized that when they said, we've come to see him as king and to worship him, I believe that we should treat it that way, that it was to worship, that they understood that it was the Son of God. And if that's the case, if they truly understood that this was King of the Jews, the promised Messiah from the Old Testament, the Son of God, we're going to bring him gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They might have understood the symbolic meaning of frankincense being used in worship. Because again, it was used everywhere in worship, even among the pagans. And if they were familiar with the prophecies regarding Christ, I'm pretty confident they understood the Old Testament qualifications for worshiping God and the incense and everything else. I had mentioned to you before that one of the largest ancient libraries was found in Babylon. And that's where the Magi were. They were from that region, and having access to these libraries, it's likely that they had access to the Hebrew Scriptures. So there may have been some religious symbolic meaning in this. They may have understood that by presenting frankincense to him, that they recognized him possibly as high priest or an offering. Again, speculation. But I'm going to look at those two things. I want to look at Jesus as high priest and as a sacrifice. And the best place to do that is the book of Hebrews. So turn to Hebrews chapter 3. And we're going to see both of these reflected here. Hebrews chapter 3, if we start in verse 1, we read this. Therefore, holy brethren, partakers of a heavenly calling, consider Jesus the apostle and high priest of our confession. Now you have to remember, the reason this is called Hebrews is because the author is clearly writing to Jews, and what he's attempting to do is to demonstrate that Jesus Christ is the high priest who offered himself up for our sake. And he's calling on his fellow Jews to not let that escape them, to not to be exposed to it and walk away from it. Because they had this awesome gift of being shown the Messiah, and of all people, the Jews should recognize him. And so he's trying to make that argument to them. Don't see and taste and experience and walk away. And so part of his argument is found in verse 1 here. Partakers of a holy heavenly calling, consider Jesus, who is the apostle and high priest of our confession. Turn to chapter 4. Jump down to verse 14. Therefore, since we have a high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, what? The Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weakness, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. Therefore, let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in time of need. So this high priest that we have is not an ordinary high priest. He passed through the heavens. He is the Son of God. There was no other high priest like him. And so we go from just he's the high priest to he's this high priest who's not only human but the Son of God. And he's able to sympathize with our weaknesses because he's been tempted in all things. So now jump over to Hebrews chapter 5, verse 1. For every high priest taken from among men is appointed on behalf of men in things pertaining to God. That means priests are assigned to be an intermediary, if you will, between God and man, in order to offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and the misguided, since he himself is beset with weakness. That means that the high priest was supposed to be compassionate, understanding when somebody came and needed to confess sin and to make offering for sin, he should recognize their sinful state. Why? Because he's sinful himself, right? Wasn't the case with Jesus, though. And because of it, he is obligated to offer sacrifices for sins, as for the people, so also for himself. And no one takes the honor to himself, but receives it when he is called by God, even as Aaron was. So also Christ did not glorify himself so as to become high priest, but he who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you," just as he says in another passage, "You are the priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek." In the days of his flesh, he offered up both prayers and supplication with loud crying and tears to the one who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his piety, his righteousness. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered, and having been made perfect, he became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation. This is different, because a high priest was not the source of salvation. He simply would make offering for the forgiveness of sins, right? But the difference was that this high priest in Jesus became the source of eternal salvation. Being designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, concerning him we have much to say, and it's hard to explain since you have become dull of hearing. So he goes on to explain to them the difference between the regular high priest and Jesus as high priest, who became ultimately the sacrifice for sin. So we jump down into chapter 10, verse 10. He says, "By this we have been sanctified through the offering," what? "Of the body of Jesus Christ once for all." Every priest stands daily ministering and offering time after time the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But he, Jesus, having offered one sacrifice for sin for all time, sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from the time onward until his enemies have been made a footstool at his feet. For by one offering he has perfected all those who are sanctified. And the Holy Spirit also testified to us. For after saying, "This is the covenant that I will make with them after those days, says the Lord, I will put my law in their heart and on their mind, and I will write them. And their sins and their lawless deeds I will remember no more. Now where there is forgiveness of these things, there is no longer any offering for sin. Therefore, brethren, since we have confidence to enter the holy place by the blood of Jesus, by his sacrifice, by a new and living way which he inaugurated for us through the veil, that is, his flesh, then since we have a great high priest over the house of God," notice you find both those principles there. His flesh as a sacrifice, but also he is the high priest. "Let us draw near with a sincere heart and full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled clean from the evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and to good deeds." And so what we see described here is that Christ was not only the high priest, he's not only the one who would use the incense in his formal duties, but he was the sacrifice, offering himself up, on which the frankincense would be placed. I'm going to wrap this all up and tie this in with another verse. You can just listen to this. I find this interesting. Ephesians chapter 5. Do you remember what we saw when we were in Leviticus chapter 2? It says that this frankincense was placed onto the sacrifice so that it might be this soothing aroma to the Lord. He could smell it, right? Ephesians chapter 5 verse 1 says this, "Therefore be imitators of God as beloved children and walk in love just as Christ also loved you," and look at this, "and gave himself up for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God as a fragrant aroma." That takes us right back to Leviticus chapter 2. So, I don't know if the Magi chose the frankincense as a symbolic representation of Christ as high priest and Christ as offering. But if they did, it would certainly fit, would it not? Because both of those things are true. Christ is the high priest, the one who can sympathize with us in our weaknesses because he was tempted just like we are. But he was also a high priest who gave up himself as a sacrifice and became a sweet-smelling aroma before the Lord. So again, I don't know if they chose it for that reason. If you really wanted to press me, I'd like to think they did. They were wise men, after all, right? The Bible doesn't tell us why they did, but I think there's good reason why so many in church history have speculated that it either represented his priesthood or the sacrificial gift, or as I've proposed this morning, you can't separate those two because he's the high priest who gave himself up. Amen?